speaker to kick off the second portion of today's is Alex from Oklahoma State. I'm going to give a little FYI. His presentation looks wonderful. Ignore the projector's quality. So don't judge him by how that looks, okay? So I will turn it over to you to get started.
Thanks, Lori. Again, my name is Alex Barnes. I'm a graduate student at Oklahoma State University working for Dr. Fullendorf and Dr. Goodman on the Prairie Project. So just a real quick introduction to what grasslands and savannas are. Grasslands are characterized by a significant amount of grass cover. They're maintained with fire and grazing, which is important to the ecological structure and function of grasslands and savannas. However, all of this is threatened due to a natural process called woody plant encroachment. Woody plant encroachment is the process of a grassland-dominated system, you can't really see it too well, to a woody plant-dominated ecosystem over time. And on this x-axis at the very top, we have woody plant encroachment that increases from a grass-dominated system to a woody plant-dominated system. And on the bottom x-axis, we have brush management. It's a lot easier to manage for woody plant encroachment when you're in grass-dominated systems or a shrub savanna than whenever you are in woody plant domination. So how does all this occur? There are four things, there are probably more that contribute to woody plant encroachment, but the four that I like to highlight are changes in disturbance regimes, changes in atmosphere conditions, an increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, overgrazing, and introduction of invasive species like tree of heaven and some other resprouting woody plant. On this, I just want to highlight that woody plant encroachment increases as annual precipitation increases. So woody cover has a relationship with annual precipitation, and as the precipitation increases, the woody cover increases. So let's talk about pyric herbivory and how we manage for woody plant encroachment. Pyric herbivory is just fire where it attracts cattle or different grazers into an area. And with this study that was done by Amanda West in 2016, we have two different pastures. We have an annual burn, and then we also have our patch burn grazing right down here. Our patch burn grazing, we divided up into three different patches for the pasture, and we saw that 70% of the time that cows are spending in these patch burn grazing areas, they're spending in the most recently burned patch. Within pyric herbivory, we have single species pyric herbivory, which is our cattle, and then we also have multi-species pyric herbivory, where in our study we use goats and cattle in conjunction with fire. There is a little bit of dietary overlap between cattle and goats. Cattle maintain a lot of grazing on grasses and forbs, whereas goats will graze and browse on forbs, grasses, and mostly trees, woody plants. For my study, for this part of this study, we're just going to look at two objectives. One is to look at the distribution of cattle and goats over a pasture and patches. And then the second one is to evaluate the response of the vegetation to the different grazing types. So we're going to look at our pyric herbivory versus no herbivory, which is just fire only. And then within the the pyric herbivory, we look at our single species and our multi-species pyric herbivory. So this study took place in Stillwater, Oklahoma. If y'all have never been to the research station out at Stillwater, Oklahoma, feel free to come down. I'd love to show you guys around. But we have 6 pastures. We divided them into 2 different treatments. We have our single species, which is in this blue. I'm sorry if you're colorblind. And then our multi-species, which is in our red. Again, we have 3 different pastures for each one of the treatments. So to look at the first objective, what our grazing distribution is like, we purchased some low-tech collars, and we put 3 collars on the cows and 3 collars on the goats for the multi-species pastures. And then we put 3 collars on the cows for each one of the single-species pastures. And this is kind of a highlight, a rundown of how we set up our different pastures. we have pasture. This is our multi-species northeast pasture, and we divide it up into 6 different patches. And each one of those patches are denoted by a different season and also a different year that we do it, that we burn inside each one of those patches. So whenever I got here, I got into Oklahoma State January 2020, and we started burning these patches right down here in the bottom left corner for each one of the pastures. And then the following summer, in August 2020, we moved up to this right corner. I'm going to be using data that is only through last summer, so we're not going to be looking at March 2022 or August 2022 data. But the one thing I do want to highlight about these pastures is that there is no cross-fencing inside these pastures at all. So the cows are able to move around freely within the pasture. For each one of these patches, we have 6 exclosures, and we have 3 target species for each one of those exclosures. We have blackberry that we're looking at, sericea, as well as sumac. And in 2020, in January, February, March of 2020, I went out there and built these permanent exclosures that we have. And then in 2021, I built new exclosures. And then 2022, I moved those new exclosures to different patches within each one of those pastures. So in total, we have about 432 exclosures out there across all the pastures. At these exclosures, we have a meter square that we do our vegetation sampling from. We're looking at cover, so we're looking at nuds as well as our Daubenmeier cover, which is just our horizontal and our vertical structure. And then we're also looking at our heights. For this talk, I just want to focus on the height aspect of it. So I'd stand about 1.5 meters away from the exclosure or from the outside of the exclosure and get the heights for the different vegetations. For the meter square, for the heights, I would subdivide the meter square into quadrants and look at the tallest plant within each one of those for the target species. So again, our objectives, evaluate the distribution, and let's take a look at that first objective. On this x-axis, we have time since fire. We have 0 to 5, 6 to 11, all the way to 30 to 36 months time since fire on the x-axis, the horizontal part. And then our y-axis, our vertical part, we have average GPS fixes across all the pastures. And again, I'm sorry if you're colorblind, but our blue bars are goats, and the orange bars are our cows. What we see is that across all the pastures, cows prefer to spend a lot of their time in the 0 to 5 months time since fire. But our goats don't really like to be in that recently burned patch. But we see that our frequency of seeing them in the 6 to 18 months time since fire increases over time. So in order to see how they were selecting for this, I used an IVLIVS electivity index, which is just a fancy way of saying I found the proportion of GPS units within a pasture of that patch. And what we found, well, first off, let me back off. This IVLIV selectivity index, it goes from 1 to -1. It can't go above 1 or below -1, so it's always going to be confined to those numbers. And what we found is that the cows are actively selecting for the 0 to 5 months time since fire, but our goats are actively selecting for 6 to 18 months time since fire. Again, the goats are actively avoiding the 18 to 36 months time since fire, and I think that's because we hadn't had a full 3-year fire rotation go through all of our pastures at that point. So let's look at the vegetation response to our different treatments. First, we'll take a look at the pyric herbivory versus fire alone with no grazing. And what we see as a pattern, as Dr. Fullendorf likes to point out, we have a pattern where our fire-only treatments are significantly higher than our pyric herbivory treatments. And that's for all 3 of our different target species, blackberry, sericea, and sumac. So splitting that apart a little bit more, looking at the multi-species and the single-species pyric herbivory, On the x-axis, we have our time since fire, 0, 6, 12, 18 months. We don't have 24 through 36 on there because the fire hadn't gone through our patches at that point. And then our y-axis, we have average maximum height. And our multi-species is this dark circle. Our single species is a dark triangle. And the no herbivory, fire only, is a dark square. Anything without any shading in it is those patches that haven't had that fire go through there yet. And what we see is that our multi-species pyric herbivory decreases with blackberry average maximum height over time, as opposed to our single species pyric herbivory, which has blackberry height increasing over time. We do see that there is that difference between no herbivory and herbivory with fire. However, with Sericea lespedeza, we don't see a separation between our two treatments, between single species and multi-species pyric herbivory, but that pattern of having significantly less maximum height compared to our no herbivory, that pattern still remains the same. And the same goes for the sumac. So real quick, I just want to talk about the economics of our study. I'm not an economist, but we do have an economist on our project, Kayla Hintz, and she published a paper back in 2021 that looked at the different management techniques and the net present value of each one of those treatments. So she looked at traditional management types, prescribed fire with cattle, so our pyric herbivory, our single species pyric herbivory, goats fed season long with supplements, goats fed late in the season with supplements, and then our breeding operation that we have. What she found was that we have a 99% probability of a net present value with our breeding operation that we have at Stillwater. So look at the actual values of our first year that we had our goats and kids. We were able to pay for the goat costs with the selling of our kids and our does last year. And we sold them for $2.99 a pound, our does. Our doe kids sold for $2.40 per head, and the buck kids sold for $2.99 a pound. I was talking to somebody earlier, and they said that they were trying to sell their goats for $4.25 a pound right now. So that price is just going up, and I expect that we would see a little bit better return on our yield this next year. If you have any other questions, the Prairie Project has a really good social media funded by Allison and Laura, and they have a lot more information about our operation if you find them on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and all that stuff. So yeah, if y'all have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Yeah, Chris.
You blew past your sumac slide really fast, but was the story there that cattle grazing and goat grazing was pretty similar in terms of sumac response?
Yeah, and the single species, which is, I just collected the last of my data from this last summer, and I was kind of playing around with it before I got here, and I hate talking about data that I haven't published or that I haven't shown or anything, but it's interesting to see the response in sumac compared to the single species and the multi-species play out over time. Whenever we go down there and we show different ranchers our research station, I like to show them a certain patch or within one of the pastures where our goats are, and tell them, like, this used to be a wall of sumac and dogwood and just a bunch of nasty stuff, and they've gone through there, and in a week they completely clear that out. We were down in Texas for the Prairie Project, and we came back that next week, and it was just completely cleared out. So.
And then what's your containment strategy with goats? How are you keeping them?
How can you keep goats? Yeah, no, that's a fair question. The fencing that we have is a really nice fencing. It's got, they paid pretty nice money for it, but as far as like the livestock guardian dogs go, we have 2 dogs for each one of the pastures, and what will happen is if there's like a predator that comes around, like a coyote or anything, the first dog will stay with the group of goats, and then the other dog will go out there and check it out and kind of scare that thing off, and if that other dog needs to come, they'll come help out, or they'll come back to the group. So
and you just have a woven wire fence around the
Yep.
exterior of each pasture?
Yeah, a woven fence. Mm-hmm. You had a question.
Is there any herbicide follow-up
No.
Sumac or?
We have not put any herbicide out at all, no.
So your woven wire fence, it's not electric fence at all, it's just woven?
No, one of our dogs is a little bit of a misfit and likes to get out a little bit sometimes, so we did put a hot wire at the very top of it, and that kept him in for a little bit, but then we had to go to different lengths to keep him in. We eventually put some PVC pipe around his neck, and he wasn't able to get out, so, yeah.
So why the choice of blackberry, sumac, and cerisium?
Those were some of the plants that our extension agents have identified that we get a lot of questions about within our area. I know that cerisium is not a woody plant, but at the same time, it's a huge, like a lot of people get a lot of questions for that, and so.
Pretty woody later in the season, really.
Yeah, yeah.
Pretty fancy.
Yeah, so another chapter of my research is we have, for each one of those pastures, or for each one of those patches, we have 3 arrays where we have terrain stacks that go 60 meters north-south, east-west, and I'm sampling every 5 meters along there and getting functional cover as well, so, yeah. I'm really excited to present that whenever I get that all ready to go, so. Yes, ma'am.
How's your spread of cerisium been? Is it really spreading much with the goats and stuff out there, keeping it down? Or-
I don't feel, that might be a question for like a beer later, yeah. 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 Yes, ma'am.
So I apologize for my ignorance, but has anybody had any success with goats browsing red cedar?
So they do. I do have some pictures and videos of goats getting on my UTV just so they can get to the eastern red cedar and eating a lot of those needles off of there.
Yeah.
They also go for a lot of post oak and blackjack oak as well. So if you have a lot of regenerative trees, I'm sure that they'd like that.
But they couldn't be used for red cedar control. They'll just eat it.
They do girdle the eastern red cedar. I don't know if it completely kills it or not, or how much it wounds it or not.
Then you'd be left with the skeletons anyway.
Yeah, yeah,
But they could be used.
yeah. Yes, Chris.
So does OSU own the goats and the cows? Are you leasing both of them or one of them? Or
I believe they do, yes.
do you know what, they lease them or they own them?
I believe they own them, yeah.
Do you, in that area with leases, do you know anything about how goats are handled on a lease basis?
I don't, but Tanner right over there, he's pretty big into the goat industry around there, and that might be a good question.
Just curious, like, up here, when somebody brings their goats onto your property, they expect you to pay them to feed their goats? And I don't think that's the same as it is down south. I'm just curious how it's handled.
Like on like a contract land clearing type of deal or what?
I think that's the only way we get goats here is if you pay the person that's got the goats in front.
Yeah, well,
Down there, it's more like a cattle lease, right? If you're feeding their goats, they pay you.
right.
Yeah,
You know,
I just wanted to make sure that was set.
yeah, a lot of people, at least around Stillwater, a lot of people will pay you to bring your goats to clear their land.
Mhm.
And so, there's a lot of contract bio land clearing going on around there now. It's thanks to OSU bringing all these
Yeah.
goats on and kind of supplementing, the local market. There's a lot more people getting into the dual species grazing
Well,
around that central Oklahoma area.
and in Durant, Texas, they even hire people to bring their goats in there instead of actually just spraying a whole bunch of herbicide along the road. They'll put some hot wire down, and they'll just have a huge stocking rate of goats, and they'll just clear through there for
That's what
2 or
it's
3
set here,
days.
too.
Which that's my backup plan if my PhD falls through. So don't steal it.
One more question.
Yeah, Jerry.
Yeah.
Would the goat grazing have to be permanent? If you took them off, would the sumac be back 2 years later?
It would grow back. Yeah, and we're not trying to completely decimate the area. We're trying to keep it a livestock operation, a cattle operation, without reducing the stocking rate for the cows by putting those goats on there. So if we took those goats off, I expect that a lot of that sumac and a lot of those other woody plants to come back. Thank you, Jerry.
All
if you have more questions,
Yeah.
he said later on.
Yeah.
And he'll be around. You can ask him more questions. We'll kind of stay on. So thank you. Here's
Yeah.
a little thank you
Thank
for
you.
presenting.
Thank you, Lori.
Yes.